Hi, everybody. Today is December 16, 2021. This is Dr. Randy Bach. I'm presenting another coronavirus conversation to and with you. Please let me know the direction you'd like this to go. Make comments, give me suggestions, so forth. I'm going to talk about the week in COVID insofar as I can. It's impossible always to capture every event and every aspect. So I look forward to covering other ones that maybe perhaps I missed. What's going on a personal level? I'm recovering from my surgery. I was in the hospital last month, minor surgery. It was only a day. I was overnight, but I got a glance at the hospitals and some of the procedures and so forth. And this came into play because I had a recent email exchange with a number of doctors, and one in particular, a couple in particular, who belong to my one of my athletic clubs. And the club recently had their medical determination and decree dictate that we have to kind of go back in time and start wearing masks again if we haven't had boosters or double boosters or whatever, depending on the situation and the type of vaccine for COVID. We are in Massachusetts. Massachusetts is not undergoing anything much in the way of a surge or difficulty with this issue, although it gets presented vastly differently from kind of the academic physician's standpoint, and those tend to dominate the medical committee for this club. I belong to another club in another town, same basic sport, racket sports and so forth, and they are doing nothing of the sort. There was a Christmas party last night, very convivial. People played tennis, and then they ate together and so forth, and pretty much no one was wearing a mask. It was weird. We were coming in the evening when a lot of the younger people were exiting, and they were wearing masks. But I think it's really kind of a personal basis. It's not required by that club in that town. And, town by town, there are a lot of different rulings and dictates, as you probably are aware. This is, I just don't know why people don't look at the metadata or the data about the data to see that, towns adjacent to each other, states adjacent to each other might have different rulings and different levels of control or over control or over strict dictates. And the data don't really present that much differently. Certainly locally, there's not much difference between the towns, and yet the way that the towns approach them are vastly different. So in this particular instance, two athletic clubs, one has no restrictions pretty much, except on a personal basis. And again, you're welcome to wear your mask. I don't really care. I think it's rather overkill in a big tennis pavilion or outdoors and so forth. And but you shouldn't be dictated to do so. And it shouldn't, if it is going to be dictated to do so, on the basis of faulty data and or misinterpretation and or an exaggeration of what in fact COVID is. This is not Ebola on wings. It's not HIV aerosolized. It's not anthrax. It's not a bunch of things which it could be at some later date if there were a more severe, infectious agent floating around, but it's not. So, smallpox, I get. George Washington's crew, I guess they were enforced to do the version of inoculation they had at the time for smallpox. This is not smallpox. This is not polio. This is not even the Spanish flu, which was far more dangerous, unvaccinated for young people than this is. The idea of vaccinating people now, when likely they've had a natural immunity occur already, is a separate problem, which likely will, in my view, bring greater cases of autoimmune problems. Anyway, so as far as this particular instance, I had a little bit of an email exchange, and let's see if I can find some of the things I said here. I don't want to go over in detail, but they made this rule that you got to wear a mask if you're not boosted by January 31st or so. It's kind of a brief what I wrote. Omicron, I don't know if they're worried about that or they're still kind of on the Delta hangover, but Delta is somewhat, was not that big a deal here. We have a lot of natural immunity, and so it's kind of a bigger deal in certain other states. It wasn't that big a deal in South Africa. India was the version with Delta, And we'll get to the India data in a second. Now, this is what I wrote. Omicron is an attenuated version. It's milder. So far, 0 deaths are attributable in the US to Omicron. And out in South Africa, it's on the level of a bad cold and mild flu. It's multiple generations down from the ancestral COVID. So as a result, the single spike protein vaccine formulations that we have now, Moderna, Pfizer, J&J and whatnot, are from the original ancestral version. They have less effect as they've had on prior variant strains versus the ancestral. So if you make a vaccine to one virus and the virus winds up mutating, it's not going to be the same. It's kind of like I know the Jonas Brothers, the Osmond Brothers. If you have recognition for one of them, doesn't mean you're going to have a perfect recognition for another one. They're related, but your scan, or the Baldwins were there in the news, Alec Baldwin. You have a good idea what Alec Baldwin's looks like. Maybe you can pick out his brother. Maybe you can't. So this is what happens as we kind of get genetic drift. Yet people. I was just going to say this about virions. The reason we get different flu shots every year is that we realize that the same. The prior year vaccination no longer has the same effect on the next year's. So we're already in the next year of COVID. I'm not saying it's as different as one influenza is from the next year's influenza, because that has a host reservoir in domestic pigs in China, and there's more time to create a different, more powerful version. But when coronavirus is kind of passing from person to person, it is going to attenuate downward. It's not going to be as strong, and it's going to be different. And if you did have, more, bad version earlier on, it's not necessarily going to have the same spike proteins on it as it would have originally. So I didn't say that very clearly, but basically, there's no sense giving last year's COVID shot for this year's COVID, given that the mutations have occurred and they're different strains. Yet people are banging their heads, or in this case, other people's arms, with last year's vaccine. If this were a flu shot, that would be borderline malpractice. You wouldn't want to give an outdated flu shot, yet that's what the recommendation is for boosters, as people are getting more cases of later versions, but of course not getting that sick. So that gives us to this next point of finding cases of COVID. It's really, kind of a pointless and meaningless exercise, given that cases, historically, a case of syphilis, tuberculosis, gout, whatever, meant you were having, a severe illness at the time, or at least some illness at the time. Now it's been dumbed down, so much else has, just means showing positive for PCR tests, whose own sensitivity is somewhat changeable depending on how many PCR cycles you put it through. So anyway, I go on, in this letter to talk about this and that, and, some of the potential side effects of boosters, recommending it for young kids and so forth. And in the club, they're going to be doing the same thing, keeping kids masked, as they're doing in our schools locally, with grave effect. So that's kind of the policy that is there. And I got an email exchange back, so maybe I'll just show this to you. Wrong thing. Let's see. So this was the playful view of the letter we got from the club, and Elvis happily getting a vaccine for something or other. I don't know what. So this has always been a kind of a case of people doing vaccines for public show. I doubt everybody was smiling. I'm not even sure this is an actual vaccine, but if it is, it's purposeful. It's to show that from somebody famous, handsome, so forth, is going to do the vaccine. So should you. So that was cleverly brought out by the club. And then after my email note, which I kind of described to you, this is one of the rather expert physicians who replied back, I think wrongly. The hospitals are simply at their capacity and beyond. It's really not an individual mandate. It's public health at its core, et cetera, et cetera. Recognize the enormous burden on society, and we need to do our part. So people are dying of COVID. And inpatient cases are doubling about every 6 days. And this is in Boston. So I think this is not true. I went and looked at the data, the facts. First of all, this is United States COVID ICU cases per million. So if this translated to Massachusetts, that would be 50 per million. It's actually translate to 500 for Massachusetts, but in fact, actually, Massachusetts has about 287 COVID cases in ICU. So we are lower than the US average. So this is kind of an absurdity right now. There was a little bit of bump in Delta, but again, this is nothing close to taxing the system. So for Massachusetts, for instance, because we'll look at some Massachusetts data later, even at the height of Delta here, that would be 70 per million, be 700 ICU cases potentially. I don't think we had that anything close to that, mind you, but even if we did, this is what Massachusetts showed in April 2020, the greatest worry era for COVID. They estimated 2,700 ICU beds. So this would be for non-COVID, this would be for COVID. But in any event, we would not be approaching full capacity, either in terms of hospital beds or ICU. So there are 2,700 available ICU beds. Massachusetts had 287 currently occupied with COVID as of yesterday or the day before. So, I don't really buy into the fact that it's doubling every 6 days. Maybe it doubled from very, very low number to something, but it's not going to keep doubling like that. If it did that over the next 10 weeks, doubled, the entire state would be in the hospital in a matter of 2.5 months or so. This is really not likely. It's not possible. It's not happening. It's exaggeration. It's absurd. And people who think this way are kind of on board with eternal masking and so forth. There's a study, I think, a couple days ago that 82% of U.S. Democrats are okay with basically eternal indoor mask constraints and rules. I think this is really weird. It's a kind of a Kool-Aid moment. This is again kind of along my reply to this other letter from the club. And why do I do this? I don't know. Because I'm sure nothing's going to happen, but this is just kind of corroborating the numbers that I was pointing out in Massachusetts. So here's something very interesting. There were 11,000 new cases and 26 additional cases of deaths reported over 3 days. My actual other monitors showed lower numbers of deaths, but so be it. This is a huge rate of cases. This is because we're finding and redefining cases as just anybody who happens to come across somebody with a swab as he's entering an airplane or a classroom or whatever. And so, we just find a lot of cases. We're looking all the time. We're finding some people with illness, but not that many severely. And the mortality, it remains amongst the elderly. This is a really difficult slide here. Way down on the bottom, I'm sure you can see number 40 is Massachusetts. We're near the bottom of the U.S. for active cases and active mortality. This is what was reported the other day, 11,000 cases, 0 deaths. And yet, we're supposed to be, basically locking down the club in a sense, not quite, but masking people and dividing people and giving people, this insignia of shame for not having gotten boosters and kind of doing this coercion policy. There were a lot of people, of course, hospitalized without COVID. I'm not going to get into that. This slide shows that proportionally higher number of unvaccinated are hospitalized. 13% of the residents in Massachusetts are unvaccinated, but they're 65% or so of the hospitalized COVID cases. So fine, if you're not vaccinated, you're taking on some risk, and so be it. But a lot of people who are not vaccinated have chosen that. I don't think it's from lack of hearing about it. And so people are allowed to make their own decisions. And again, the death rate is extraordinarily low from this currently. So that was kind of like my presentation for my club. We're having a meeting tonight. I'm just guessing that nothing will happen from anything I've written. So be it, right? And there you have it. I'm just going to maybe go over some things that slightly interested me over the last week. Try to make this interesting for you. Well, I guess maybe I'll start out with something that happened to me again. And I'll start out with a slideshow here. Hold on just a second. So before we get to that, this is kind of a cute aspect of Omicron. I think this is my club. A lot of doctors, doubling every 6 days. This is exaggeration. It's all something we all have to do together. We have to bond together. We are forgetting our own liberties. And the reason, we fought, the British to have self-rule. We have individual states, fortunately. That's acting as a little bit of a firewall. I'll get to that in a little bit. So here's the Grinch that can't quite get himself to steal Christmas. This is Omicron, and this is a lot of your government and media. I might be repeating myself, of the left. Come on, do something. Well, they are doing some things, mind you. And this is something that happened to me, as it were. As my Thanksgiving coronavirus conversation is on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. Only YouTube knocked it down. I recommend you go check it out. It was published around Thanksgiving Day. It's medical. Apparently, it's medical information. Does not allow content that contradicts local health authorities, WHO, and COVID. So YouTube doesn't allow you to contradict authorities. This is, again, far from the question authority rationale that the current baby boomers, when they were in their halcyon younger days, they espoused. And now it's a matter of bullying and kicking people off. I can guarantee you that. I can't guarantee. I think for the most part, I don't say things that aren't data backed. And if it's an opinion, I tell you it's an opinion. So this is my video on YouTube currently. I wrote back, I'm happy to back up any particular factual statement. Would you please tell me what's objectionable? No, that's really beyond them. They can just delete it, but they won't tell you. One of the things I said was that evil preaches tolerance, but then when it's dominant, it tries to silence good. I think that's something interesting. I also quoted Geert Vanden Bossche, and I quoted him, I saying that I don't buy into everything he says, but even so, if the process of science is questioning, and if you can't deal with that, then I don't know what's the use of this whole endeavor. So we have to make counter sites. There's Odyssey, there's Rumble, and whatnot. YouTube, I think it's really strange. I did make this appeal. We'll see what happens. It's a slide I liked. Freedom is not a reward for compliance. That's how jails work. And this is kind of the way we're getting herded around, and we're bullied in a sense. This is Israel, which is getting an advanced monitoring system. It's going to tie your COVID data with your GPS. Germany and Austria already have, and they've apparently instituted rules to keep the unvaccinated solely at home. So you're not going to be able to walk around. It's kind of ironic that Israel is doing very similar. So it's hard to make fun of Germany and Austria for their Nazi past when the victims' own country later on, Israel is doing things that might be somewhat in league. So I think it's a human thing. I don't think it's a national thing, a nationalism thing. It's, I think, its own separate virus of misinformation, which they tend to call anything opposing it misinformation. The longer you comply, the worse it's going to get. This is, I believe, is an Israeli-American, what is he? I don't know, philosopher, writer, talking about, basically, passports as anybody who disagrees with vaccine passports as a Luddite. So this is kind of insulting your anybody who disagrees with your argument. So it's kind of like there's a joke. How do you keep a lawyer from drowning? You take his foot off, take your foot off his neck. So if you can quarantine people long enough, then you can reward them by unquarantining them. So as long as they do what you want. So that kind of gets back to the Lisa Simpson slide. Maybe I had them poorly ordered, but this is really the rebuttal to Mr. Etzioni. I was at a pandata.org meeting the other day, and we were fortunate to have John Rulak with us. And these are some of the notes I made. The Chris Cuomo firing at CNN is unrelated, but I found it interesting. When his brother was no longer governor, Chris Cuomo was no longer useful. They were paying him $6 million to be a host, and in a sense, it's graft. It's like when they one of the networks paid Chelsea Clinton $600,000. It's not because she or Chris Cuomo are great reporters or moderators or whatever. They might be decent. I mean, they are educated and whatnot, they speak the language, but they get chosen because they are access to somebody else. And these are like the same. These are payments in kind. It's when the Obamas get a, I don't know how many millions or tens or hundreds of millions of dollars Netflix deal. It's not because they're great movie directors or producers. It's because they have a name and it's going to align with certain favors down the road. This is money in kind. So when Hillary's book gets a pre-sale of $5 million when she's in the Senate, 10 or 15 years ago, it's not because she's a great author. It's not because people are going to buy the book. It's going to get remaindered. It's a form of payment. So I bring this up because one of the more astute members was pointing out that the pharma ads, when they give these very obscure medicines commercials on TV, it's for something that nobody has pretty much, very low rates of people having it, some psoriatic arthritis, whatever, which you could advertise on, much more direct marketing, social media groups and so forth, if you really wanted to get people with psoriatic arthritis or some other rare condition. But they wind up paying the networks a certain amount just to be there. So it's kind of remember me and try not to tread on me or else you're going to lose our money. So a lot of what happens, I think, I'm not a big conspiracy guy, but I do think that the Cuomo incident, where they got rid of him theoretically for morals violations, but they didn't get rid of Jeffrey Toobin for morals violation. They didn't get rid of Don Lemon for morals violation. There are producers who are chasing skirt and whatnot, and they don't get, they're not disappeared for morals. But Chris Cuomo is all of a sudden only right directly after his brother's disappearance or undoing as well, mind you, for the wrong reasons. He should have been gone for COVID malpractice, bringing people back into the nursing homes. Anyway, so John Rulak was there, and he's CEO of a kind of a naturopathic type of company. And I had not heard of him, but I'm going to maybe show one of his articles. He's talking about ivermectin shopping and how hard it is to do, and he's made some conduits to do the same. So you might want to check out some of what he says. He was pointing out that he went to one of these organic food conferences because that's what he does, and all the aged hippies, post-hippies, 1960s, 70s hippies, they're, no longer questioning, but actually, enforcing authority. So they're making everyone do the vaccine, passports and whatnot. So it really comes down to, kind of a self-preservation thing. I think the oldsters have been so terrified and frightened from the constant drumming of their own reverb that, the bad news has generated our bad news. And so it's just a weird thing. So this is my own thought that, so anyway, he had, and he's not a right-leaning person. He had to go to Fox just to kind of get basic, sensible news. And I always recommend, leaving all those behind and just kind of use your fingers to do the walking and try to find your own facts out there. They're very good sites, and I go over a lot of them week by week. So I recommend you do the same. One vulnerability, if we think of the kind of fascism virus or the totalitarian or the communist virus, the one that likes to, take control of your life and not let it go. I think that just the way the 9/11 terrorists found the weakness in the airlines system. I mean, they won't let you take a gun on and so forth, but the box cutters got in and 9/11 happened. And then they were on the search for box cutters after that. But there was a clear weakness there. Then the shoe bomber found a different weakness, that your shoes, then we had to take off the shoes. So there's always kind of an act and react where hackers and terrorists and whatnot find the weakness in the system. Then you have to figure out a way to fix that so your system, is not suicidal. I think, the United States has done really kind of miserably, especially, by carrying this on through the Biden era much longer than need be, when in fact there was very little, kind of case fatality basis for COVID after 2020. Anyway, but we don't have a genuine democracy. We have a Republican form of government. That is to say, we have a constitution, and we have to obey its rules. And there's a protection of the minorities' rights. So, true democracy is three wolves and a sheep voting on what's for dinner, and that's the sheep. And so you need to preserve the rights of the minority. In this case, the minority are those who are a little bit skeptical for one reason or another, and it's both black and white, and it's left and right. and they don't necessarily want to follow along, and they don't necessarily feel at risk, et cetera, whatever the reason is, or they've already had the illness and they don't want to do what you say they have to do because you're potentially, actually, in this case, almost always wrong over and over again. But the countries that can do this kind of, all at once, I mean, China, for instance, but we know China is kind of a totalitarian communist regime, I think at the very least authoritarian, to make a fine distinction. But it's shocking to see Australia, New Zealand, Austria, countries that we see as democracies do almost precisely the same thing and or worse. But this is, this is off topic, perhaps for coronavirus, but I think there's a weakness in the parliamentary system. The United Kingdom does not have a constitution. They have kind of an oral code, and they try to follow it and so forth. But if you have the parliamentary majority in any of those countries, you essentially have a temporary, but you have a full dictatorship of that point of view. I mean, oddly enough, I think Australia and the UK are right of center governments technically, and I think New Zealand and some of the other countries with draconian measures are left of center. But in either case, they are allowed to kind of do everything all by themselves. They don't have filibusters. They don't have individual states protesting and so forth. So we should count our blessings in a sense that we have the crucible of multiple different experimentations going on, because we have states' rights and we have individuality across the board. Anyway, so let's get back to what we have here. So this is from John Rulak's article. I'll let you pause this and look at it if you want. I'm just going to move on. But his point basically is that if you want to get COVID before it keeps mutating, I don't think the mutation is necessarily all bad. I think they tend to go towards, the common cold. The coronavirus that we have as a common cold likely was some kind of bat or pangolin bug at some point, and it got to humans. But in order to go from human to human to human, it can't knock you over too hard. So I don't take fully his point here, but be that as it may, if you did want to get rid of all at once, you shouldn't get rid of the possibility of treatments. And we haven't really disproved that some of these treatments work. A lot of the countries that had very mild reactions are much more medication-based than vaccine-based. For instance, India, which had the Delta variant and survived it very nicely, really with very low rates of vaccination, around 10 to 15%. There's another one slide here, which is sad. This was 2015. But it's pointing out that it's hard to believe medicine, possibly because so much happens. This is humans, I guess. Humans tend to group and they tend to follow the leader, and they tend to try to preserve their grants and all the kind of stuff. Nobody really wants to, be the nail that sticks out that gets hammered. To that point, obedience and conformity happens in every group. The Milgram Experiment is very famous. I think it was at Yale in the 1960s. I wasn't aware of the Ash experiments, but very similar in the 1950s. And people go along as long as they're told that's what they should be doing. They're given assurance by people around them. They do cruel things. So in the Milgram experiment, if you're not familiar with it, you should look it up. But they actually weren't. The people on the other side of the screen or the glass were paid actors, but the subject was asked to keep turning up the electrical shock based on the wrong answer given by the putative subject. And people went all the way. They went basically to torture zones as long as the researchers and the nice men in coats told them it was okay to do so. And so what we are seeing now is kind of a groupthink kind of thing, and punishment being meted out on very flimsy basis. This is, getting to the hypocrisy, kind of the class system. When you go in a restaurant, the servers, and they're probably vaccinated. Massachusetts, 80% of people are vaccinated approximately. And so likely all your servers, wait staff are, and yet they're wearing masks. Why? Because Charlie Baker said so. He doesn't have a good rationale. I'm sad and sorry over Mr. Baker. I think he's been a disappointment. I met him about a month ago, and I told him that. He was very defensive. I didn't tell him precisely everything I just said, but I pointed out the restaurant example. I gave him a quick slide showing that if you're sitting in a restaurant, you can wear no mask. If you're standing in a restaurant, the opening, you have to wear a mask because coronavirus goes at 6 feet height, which of course would contradict this view here, where the students are dutifully having to wear masks, and whoever these are, people shoveling don't. This is idiotic. vaccinated or not, they're not going to catch anything outdoors. Mind you, young kids don't really get any illness from this anyway. Similar piece of hypocrisy. This was from, I believe, 2020. This was a conservative party. And this is a time they were telling everybody to wear masks, and they're having a party close up. This is prior to vaccine and whatnot. So I don't have a problem with this personally. They're young. They should be doing whatever they want because COVID is not that big a problem. They might as well get ill and get it over with because natural immunity is probably 27 times, 30 times better than vaccine immunity. But this kind of like better, rules for thee, but not for me is what carries on. This is just a cute little meme somebody made, and you have to be not the sheep. This is a side little issue that had me interested because, I saw some Purell the other day and I looked at the ingredients, pretty much alcohol, ethyl alcohol, which is the stuff in vodka and whiskey and everything else you drink at the bar. And this was from 2015, I believe. Teens drinking hand sanitizer. Maybe it was earlier. Maybe it was like, I forget what year it was. This was from 2009 or 12. But anyway, some time ago, way before COVID. And, the teens drinking hand sanitizer. So this was an issue back then. And yet we've just seen this huge multiplication of hand sanitizer when we don't really think about what's going on. Are teens doing this still? And, so I tried to search this. This was kind of an issue back then when there wasn't really much hand sanitizer in the schools and whatnot. And if you Google it, the last real big article was in February 2021, children, keeping hand sanitizers away from young kids. But there's very little, if you Google it, teens drinking hand sanitizer, CNN, there's very little current about it. These are posts are, way before COVID. And this is, so there seems to be, kind of a little bit of ignoring this problem. I think, Google modulates what you see and CNN chooses to do stories or not. Again, most of the news bias is in omission. So I think you really have to, think about this, but I just don't know how big an issue it is. I imagine, there's a huge, relatively huge bump in diseases of despair. The heroin addiction numbers are up, I think, 40% for deaths in the last, the 12 months starting with COVID. I assume they're doing about the same now. Poor economy, draconian rules, depression, sadness, despair, isolation, all this kind of stuff. I imagine kids are drinking hand sanitizer because I don't know if there's any denaturant in it that prevents you from doing so. I don't think it's necessarily anything but, kind of vodka in gel form. For all the people who wear a mask while alone in the car, the new outdoor seatbelt, this is just cute. This is kind of where we are now, sadly enough. I don't know whether, these people realize that, this version of pro wrestling is fake. I bring it up all the time and people say, oh, we have data. We just look at the data differently, blah, blah, blah. And this is the replies I've gotten so far. Let's agree to disagree. Happy holidays. I don't think it's happy. It's hard for me to be happy when there's so much foolishness going on. This is something I just happened to see on Amazon. Maybe you should buy one if you have to go masked. People selling these face mask fan. And you insert it on the side of the mask there, and it, of course, obviates any purpose of the mask, but maybe, I don't know if people will hear it or see it. I just don't know who actually does this. I just thought it's funny, but you can buy one. This is kind of the bullishness and the bullying aspect. I think Harvey Weinstein puts the bull in bullying. And this is kind of the way I feel about my clubs making certain rules that will keep me from doing the thing I like to do, playing sports and whatnot, by virtue of their absurd, draconian, over-strict political application of data. And this is a cute little, well, not cute, nice tweet from a guy I follow, Zuby. And people like living in fear. If you tell them that anything that will question their fear bubble, they get angry at you. This is, I rate this as true based on my own interactions. And I've mentioned them here before. This was a worker at a store I went to recently. He has a mask mandate from his employer. He has an interesting attitude towards it. I've mentioned this previously regarding the NBA doing something very similar. Let's see how we're doing on time here. Well, I'm going to just probably go over a few things still. Let me see if I can get them up for you. Let's see if there's anything of great interest here. I'll just show you some of the things very briefly. I'll kind of graze by some of the things that I've been looking at. So you can't see this picture, perhaps it's a video, maybe you can. This is the slide I showed about Israel doing that. Next, this is kind of excess mortality. If you look at the United States, there's really not that much going on, a little, maybe tiny bit from Delta, but it's hard to say whether that's from COVID. There's been a lot of postponement of other illnesses and problems from the prior year. So, and there's also disease of despair. The United States is not doing very much. We're not getting very sick. We're not having much excess mortality currently. So to have crazy rules going on right now is really not pointful. I don't believe. So the next one was this is the psychology of fact checking. This is really not absolutely on point, but I think it's a reasonable article. I don't think he's from the right. I think from the middle or from the left, and points out how people look at things based on all the echo chamber of stuff that they have in their own mind. So what we think are factual is in large regard based on the environment of things we actually see in advance. So this is kind of on masks and mask necessity, and the in blue was replaced with a mask mandate, and this is active cases. There's not huge differences between mask mandate and mask optional, but the places with mask optional had lower case rates than those where they're mandating masks. Maybe this is something I'm going to show to my club as well. This is from Marty McCary. I recommend you follow him. Nothing captures the problem more than this, requiring a booster in a young, healthy, low-risk student who has already had natural immunity. So this is, I frankly think this should be a legal case. I think this is craziness. And we'll just leave it there. Something else, I was looking at the new normal and the civil society deception. This is kind of a tough read for a video cast, but I'll send the link for this. I'll copy and paste this later, and I recommend you look at it. It's kind of changing the way that we govern. So I think this speaks to what I mentioned before about the parliamentary system versus Republican form of government, where you have checks and balances and you have a constitution and so forth, and states can't just do the tyranny of the majority through parliament. But these are some of the agencies and agents of this type of change, so that weirdly enough, like multiple places on earth are following the same kind of extra governmental directions based on a lot of this. The globalists, the anti-globalists, were not necessarily wrong when they point this stuff out. So you can look at this. I'm not sure I agree with everything in it. I haven't read it in full. Here's a little bit of Schadenfreude. Moderna's mRNA flu vaccine. This is from Science, and again, not a guy who's it's from Derek Lowe, not the baseball pitcher, and he writes pretty middle of the road on health issues, and he's pointing out that their mRNA vaccine is actually less than average in efficacy versus the old-fashioned one. So there's nothing magical per se about mRNA type vaccines. And I recommend you take a look at that. I can give you the link as well. I'll make a little copy here. So what else we got? So Moderna's stock price, he points out, went down when this flu stuff came around. I'll leave that there. I'm gonna maybe talk, kind of leave this here. You can look at it on your own later on. somebody brings up the case of Tanzania. We talk a lot about South Africa and certain other countries, but Tanzania has, I think, 65 million people, and they've had essentially zero COVID deaths. I don't know why that is. I haven't researched it. Maybe that's another episode if you're interested. We'll come back to that. But there are a lot of places on earth where they have problems bigger than COVID, and they pay attention to those problems, or they pay attention to no problems at all. Let people go as they will, and maybe they're not doing a lot of testing, but it doesn't seem to be a big societal worry. It's a tropical-ish country, and they're outdoors a lot. Maybe they don't get that sick that much. Maybe it's a younger population. They're not skewing elderly the way Japan, Western Europe, and the United States and so forth are. I don't know the answer to this, but not every place, with a lot of people is having a problem with COVID. This is the John Rulak article, and I'll copy this as well. And he's got some good points here. These are where the slides are from. And again, he is not from the left, but he is open-minded and convincible. And he points out that there's very little difference in case rates at the very least. I do think there's a difference in hospitalization rates, mind you, so I don't buy into every bit of this, but I think you can take a look at it. This is an unrelated article, but it speaks to that Marcia Angel quote that from Rulak's article about trust in medicine. This is partially and possibly where the trust issue is disappearing in medicine. That there's kind of this critical race theory aspect imbuing all aspects, from medical school on up. And so people are following dogma rather than science, even though they're called scientists. And we're supposed to apply various, kind of like, university academic philosophizing, theorizing aspects to accumulation of scientific data. Notably, the both editors of JAMA, Journal of American Medical Association, within the last 12 months were basically fired or resigned from their posts on critical race theory aspects. I think Dr. Bauschner, who's in Boston, said that he didn't feel that he ever, looked at people differently, treated them differently based on race. And he didn't know anybody who did. And he, apparently that is a race crime to say that you're race blind, because he doesn't acknowledge that you are racist by thinking you're race blind. So, I've treated, thousands, tens of thousands of patients over the years, and people are different. They come from different cultures, different places, different language, different classes, and so forth. They're nice people, bad people, good people, fun people, funny people, interesting people, difficult people, sick people, etc. And when push comes to shove, you're treating the symptom, the illness, the problem. And I would, really, I challenge anybody to find any difference that I've ever made in terms of what's going to happen. I think there might be differences in how people follow up or listen to or involve themselves with their care. But I kind of think that's a class and education thing, and probably also just an interest thing, how people want to do what they're doing. I mean, some people smoke cigarettes. They're taking a different view of their life. Maybe they enjoy cigarettes. They enjoy cigarettes more than thinking about whether they're going to live to 95 or something like that. People take it as they come. And I think this kind of circles into the booster aspect as well. Anyway, I don't want to talk too much. You probably already have. Let's see if there's anything interesting here. Moreover to go on. This is the hand sanitizer stuff I mentioned before. This is an unrelated article from Quillette. This is from 2020. It's just a sad case where the universities in Canada, Nova Scotia, I believe, there were, an entire department was told to take the indigenous people's point of view over science. This is regarding saving the fishery areas off the coast of Nova Scotia, and that's a big industry out there, and they want to preserve the lobsters year by year. So that means you don't get them all, you don't catch them all, otherwise, the babies won't be allowed to grow into adults that you can catch as adults. And one of the Indian tribes, or Native Canadian, indigenous Canadian tribes, was violating this, and to talk about it at the university would be impinging on indigenous people's rights. And it would be best if everybody stopped this. And this directive came from on high. And this is kind of the pollution of not just medicine in this case. This is kind of the academy in general, that everything's being looked at through a racial lens, which is really sad, given the supposed war to end all wars, World War II, and we learned our lesson about racism from that. But now we're just kind of reapplying racism through a slightly different lens and perspective. There's a cute set of tweets here, basically pointing out an analogy of the computer virus with the coronavirus. And this is one that really goes into the whole NGO governmental aspect of the way governments are being kind of turned against them, their own people. I recommend you take a look at that as well. This is another article I'm not going to be able to have time to get into, but it's in theme and in keeping with kind of this sacrificing personal freedom for the greater good, as it were. And it's not necessarily your determined greater good. But again, if this were smallpox, I would understand it. It's not. I think I'm going to call it a day on this because a lot more stuff to get to, but I can't get to everything. I hope you had some stimulation and interest from this broadcast. If you have suggestions, please let me know. I'd love to hear them and